see our gardens really sort of brightening up the community. What I really would hope is all of the new charter schools that are coming in will make the Woodlawn community very attractive for families. For people who are working in the city, it's could be a very attractive place to live. Easy commute. Because of the loss of buildings, a lot more green space than most communities in the city have. And the big asset is being right next to Jackson Park. Of course, that is also what helped Woodlawn really grow, because a lot of the housing, some of the housing at least here and in Hyde Park, was built for people who were constructing the 1893 World's Fair. So these people here had a front row seat to the World's Fair.
Did you get to go to the World's Fair?
I'm old, but not that old.
So,
I mean, 1893, what would that make me? If I were one in 1893. Yeah, it would make me really old. Yeah. So,
I'm gonna say, how long did y'all have y'all garden here in Woodlawn, in the church?
well, it's interesting. I was working on some glass slides that were how you put pictures up on the wall or messages up on the wall a long time ago. And before we even moved to this site, the congregation was located at 41st and King Drive in Watts Metropolitan. And they had community gardens there as part of what they called the Railroad Mission, which was sort of one of the settlement houses. Not as well known as Hull House. Jane Addams had some good PR people, but there were a lot more settlement houses like Hull House. And one of them was the Railroad Mission that was sponsored by this congregation. That started State Street and about 12th Street. There were lots of railroad tracks there.
There's lots of railroad tracks in Woodlawn too.
No, well, the Illinois Central came through on what's now the Metra tracks. So it was heavy freight tracks because they went downtown, that area that is east of Michigan and north of Randolph was a huge railroad yard. And there were at least 6 or 7 boat slips. Yeah. So grain from central and southern Illinois would come up and be loaded onto ships to be shipped east. So the tracks here were elevated because of the Columbian Exposition. So, and the L that went down 63rd Street took visitors to the Columbian Exposition right to the fairgrounds. So, and do you know what building is left from the fair?
What building?
It's now the Museum of Science and Industry.
Man, that's interesting.
I always read about the Columbian Exposition, and am totally fascinated. They really didn't have many health and safety laws, so because the buildings were put up quickly, most of them were really flimsy. They were made to look like they were covered with stone, but it was just plaster of Paris with straw in it.
Alright, so it wasn't really that strong at all.
No, and there was a fire and it burned most of the grounds down. But the Museum of Science and Industry had the Fine Arts building in it.
Alright.
And since they had valuable art in it, they made it with brick construction and then put what they called staff, which was the plaster of Paris with straw in it,
Mm-hmm.
sprayed it on to make it look like a very fancy building. And that is the one building that survived from that. For a long time, the tea house on Wooded Island survived. And there were also brought for that some replicas of Columbus's ships. And in the 40s, some kids set that on fire. The tea house has been rebuilt. And what's now the Museum of Science and Industry was the first location of the Field Museum.
Is the tea house still there?
The tea house is still on Wooded Island, but it's not the original one.
Alright. That's enough.
I have a few more questions for you. How would you say the racist, like racial things, was going on when you were around?
Um, well, we'll talk about this congregation. When they, I have to admit that when they decided to move from 41st and what's now King Drive, it was called Grand Boulevard originally, and then it was South Park. The move was because the community was rapidly turning over from white to black, and in fact, we sold the building to a black congregation. That was Metropolitan Community. I think it's Metropolitan Community. It was Metropolitan something, and that's actually where the railroad porters had their union meetings. When they moved here, there were restrictive covenants. Do you know what those are? It was ruled that by law and common agreement that blacks were not allowed east of Cottage Grove.
Interesting.
So, and in fact, some of our members, they had parents and grandparents who attended the University of Chicago. Now, if they were by themselves, they could live in International House. But if they brought their family, the university helped them find housing west of Cottage Grove. Now, in the late 1940s, I want to say 1948, but I'm not totally sure, the Supreme Court ruled that those restrictive covenants were illegal. Of course, by that point, this community was already beginning to see really sad times. Partly what happened, comparing this community to Hyde Park, it was a much more uniform development and much more upper middle class housing. So these apartment buildings that lined the street were 3 or 6 flat, like the building across the street. All right. During the Depression, not as many people could afford these big apartments. Then during World War II, there was a shortage of housing. So the owners of these buildings, and this is part of my point too, in Hyde Park you will see a 6 flat, but next to it are smaller houses. So it wasn't this uniform streetscape. So the owners of these apartment buildings split them into smaller apartments. The building across the street at one time was converted into 18 units. Uh, but no more bathrooms than what was built originally. Uh, so the housing here was heavily abused.
Last but not least, would you recommend families to move into the Woodlawn community?
Personally, because I'm always very concerned about education, I'm seeing real possibilities, but my concern would be, where are you going to educate your children? Um, that, you know, when we bought our townhouse in Hyde Park, we were concerned that it would be in a really strong elementary school district.
Well, I guess this wraps up our interview. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time.